Has it given you the recording in progress?
Yes. Yes.
So it's always weird talking as if I'm talking to other people when there's no one else actually here. So this is Moritz, who I recently met on a video with Ecolinguist, that I think one of them has now been released and others are yet to be released. And he is a non-native North Frisian speaker. And North Frisian is an endangered language that's spoken in the far north of Germany, although it's not, I mean, it is related to German, but it's not a dialect of German in any sense. And I thought it would be interesting to have him on to talk a little bit about his experiences with North Frisian, and maybe to sort of compare notes on phonology and stuff like that. So if you'd like to introduce yourself and your association with North Frisian.
Yes, my name is Moritz. I am from North Frisia, which is a region at the North Sea, close to the German-Danish border. I'm from an island called Söl, or Sylt in German. I'm not sure how the English pronunciation of that island is, or in Danish, Sil. I lived there for not a really long time, but I lived all over Germany, so it's the place where I lived the longest, between 2003 and 2008. So I was a lot smaller then. I learned North Frisian there in kindergarten and elementary school. It was I think a voluntary subject to choose in school. I learned it there a bit, and for the last few years, I tried to teach it myself through online media, through media that exists, which is not a lot. North Frisian has around 10,000 speakers, and is extremely endangered, is on the red list, I think, of the UNESCO for endangered languages. And especially the dialect that I'm speaking, which is called Söl'ring, has only about 600 speakers. And I think the data from those numbers are from 1970. So they're at least 50 years old. And I guess there are a lot less, but it is also still taught in schools on the island. And I'm very interested in languages. I'm currently studying linguistics and Scandinavian studies at the University of Kiel in Schleswig-Holstein in northern Germany. And that's to me. And I was invited, I'm very happy to be here, by Simon to speak a little bit about my experience with North Frisian, with maybe also growing up in a very linguistically diverse place. And also, of course, the similarities to Old English and to Frisian, which are very closely related languages. Yeah.
Thank you very much indeed for coming on. Hopefully these aren't boring questions to start off with, but would you say that I feel like with a lot of endangered languages, it's the case that most of the people who speak them are older. Would you say that's the case, or most native speakers are older? Is that the case with North Frisian?
Yeah. Firstly, I have to say I've never met a native speaker of North Frisian. There are, of course, still a few, but I would say, there are at least 70. And it's a generation of the older population. Younger people still learn it in school, but it's also, I don't know if that's an accurate comparison, but it may be a little bit more like the Gaelic languages are taught. It's more seen, it basically transforms, it is in a state of transforming from a actively spoken language more to a heritage language, if you can say something like that, where people basically have a basic understanding of it and also can speak it to a certain extent, but it's not really in active use because there aren't any monolingual North Frisian speakers. They don't exist because the infrastructure wouldn't be enough for someone who didn't speak German to live in North Frisia, which is a part of Germany.
Talking about the sort of the Gaelic situation, I've heard people say, I'm not linked to that situation myself, but I've heard people say that the fact that a lot of people who now speak Gaelic are non-native speakers who've learned it or taught it to themselves means that a lot of constructions from their native language, which is usually English, get kind of imported into it, and it ends up being like a kind of anglicized version. I suppose because North Frisian's more closely related to standard German than Gaelic is to English. Maybe it's a different situation, but do you think that people who learn it kind of learn it in a more German way and don't learn the constructions that native speakers might use?
Yes, definitely. I think there are also some like grammatical and also I think syntax reasons. Syntax is also the English word, right? Yeah. I want to apologize if my English isn't perfect. I'm a German native speaker, so yeah, if I maybe mistook some words or confused certain words, I maybe apologized for that. Yes, I think some syntactical similarities are also because North Frisian, or at least the dialect that I speak, Söl'ring, can be basically translated word by word, so that a lot of basically the sentence structure is identical to modern German. So it is very easy just to learn a few words of Frisian and then embed them into a German sentence. And also in my experience, it is quite usual to, because there are a lot of people that speak it a bit, just to integrate certain German words if you can't figure out what the Frisian was. So it's quite normal just to use a German word if you don't know what the original Frisian was, and that's socially acceptable. That's my experience with the situation.
So you mentioned the syntax is the same, and so people can just sort of a lot of the time get away with embedding Frisian words into German sentences. Are there aspects of the syntax and the grammar that would differ from German? Like, is the inflectional morphology less? Like, is the case system less complex? Or I feel like German has a pretty complex case system as Germanic languages go.
Yeah, that's of course a very big difference. There are also some sentence structure things. For example, there is the dative construction that is pretty standard in standard German, in standard High German, which is expressed with a dative pronoun in a certain position. That is possible in North Frisian. Also, little disclaimer, I can only speak for the dialect that I learned, which is Söl'ring, which isn't the biggest of the dialects. So it also is insular dialect. So there are differences between the dialects and where they are spoken. Right. It exists. Basically, you can say "hedöde or "de" oder "hemedön," which is basically you can use it in the German way where you have dative pronoun, but it's also "to me," which would be then "to me." So he gives something to me, or he gives me something. Those are both possibility. And this "to me," this construction doesn't really work in German, I think. I never heard it. Right. And that is also a possibility. So there can maybe be a similarity to English with this construction.
So is it like in German, a dative construction would be more like er gibt mir? So you wouldn't use the preposition at all. Okay.
Yeah, and in Frisian it would be basically if you say in German er gibt es zu mir, right, which doesn't work in German, which you can't do in German, but in Frisian it's still allowed. I think both possibilities work. I have my trusty text Söl'ring, my collection of texts and stories in Frisian, and I also have, if it comes up, my Söl'ring Urtabok, which is my word book, my dictionary for the dialect. So if we have to look something up, we can do so. Yeah.
When you said "to me," is that "me" a kind of weak form of a pronoun that also has a stronger form, or is it always pronounced "me" even in stressed situations?
It's always pronounced like that, I think. To the point case system, a real case system doesn't exist in Söl'ring, in North Frisian. if I say North Frisian, I also I want to keep the possibility out that there are certain dialects that I'm not that familiar with which maybe have still some case system, but in the dialect that I learned, there is no case system except for pronouns where they are still, so similar to other Germanic languages. Yeah, and it's, I think, similar to the English pronouns, personal pronouns, that you have basically a nominative, then you have a genitive pronoun, and you have an obliquus. That's how it calls in an oblique form, which is basically the dative and the accusative fell together to one thing. And yeah, for the first person, that would be ich, which is in the nominative, min, and me.
Okay.
Yeah. So
oh, sorry.
I think we have a slight delay, so I'm sorry if I interrupt you.
That's okay. You go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, but I don't think there's like a stressed version where you have a non-schwa pronunciation of the big. It's always m. Yeah, the pronunciation of Söl'ring especially is very much reflected in its orthography. And there we can talk about that later about the orthography. Yeah.
Before we started, we were talking a little bit about the modern situation of the language and maybe why it's become so endangered. So we could always talk about that next if you're happy to talk about it.
Yep.
So you mentioned that part of the problem is sort of living costs in the area where North Frisian is spoken, and the sort of demographics of people who speak North Frisian being displaced by the fact that they can't afford to live there. Is that something that's been going on for a long time, or do you think the language was in decline anyway, or do you think that's been the main driving force?
I think the language already or always had a difficult situation because North Frisian never was independent. The North Frisians never had a state of their own. They were always either a part of Denmark or a part of Germany. So they also always had a dominant language, basically, that was a big influence. And especially on the islands, they had a better chance of surviving, of the languages surviving on the islands because they were more isolated. That is also a thing you can see nowadays, that on the mainland, the North Frisian basically merged a little bit more with Low German, which was then the predominant language that came basically in. So the situation always was kind of difficult. The North Frisians, maybe also interesting information is North Frisia is nowhere near the two other Frisias, so West and East Frisia. It is about 100 kilometers to the northeast. So North Frisia is actually more east than East Frisia, so which is a little bit confusing sometimes. But it was basically I don't know if you can say it was a colony, but it was a place where not really many people lived. And through hardship, maybe mostly I think in the 8th century, a lot of Frisians moved into the Utlande, which they were called by this point, and settled down there. That was a very difficult terrain. There were mostly swamp, and I don't know if does the word floodlands exists. They were basically basically very inhospitable places. But they were kind of used to it for living in basically Old Frisia. And there they came into contact with the Angles, with the Saxons, with Slavic tribes sometimes, which all basically lived in that space. Yeah. Also, a very interesting thing to the Utlande is they looked very differently than they do now. This place, which is modern North Frisia, lost over 40% of its land area due to flooding. And in contrast to the Dutch, which were very good at reclaiming land, the North Frisian basically struggled a little bit more. That has something to do with the tides, with currents, the Gulf Stream basically hitting North Frisia head on in the North Sea. And yeah, they lost over the centuries, sometimes overnight. There were two very, very strong floods, one in 1362, I think, and one in 1634. And they basically destroyed entire islands, hundreds of towns. It's also a big source of folk mythology. We basically have our own Atlantis, which actually existed. A few years ago, they actually found archaeological proof for that. And yeah, but living with the sea, living basically in a very difficult territory was a strain basically on the North Frisian people, and was a very difficult situation over the centuries. And then you also had basically the Prussians, the Danish occupying certain lands, often also splitting the land of actually North Frisia between Denmark and Germany, or Prussia in that way. Was a bit difficult. And then in the 20th century, when it became 100% Prussian after the plebiscite, I don't know if that's a widely known fact, but there was I think the word is plebiscite, right? No,
yeah.
No, yeah. There was a voting where the border between Germany and Denmark basically should go. And in 1920, there was the current border drawn. Yeah, which made North Frisia for the first time entirely German or Prussian. And the Prussians, basically the higher classes, found out that it's a very nice looking region. It's a region with a lot of potential for tourism. So it became, especially my home island of Sylt, became basically a hotspot for the rich and famous, for the upper class. We have a 40 kilometer long sand beach, giant dunes, a lot of wildlife, also one of the most biological diverse regions of Germany, not if the most diverse, with porpoises, with seals, a lot of species, with basically all kinds of maritime things. And that was just very attractive to the upper class. So I think after the Second World War, it was basically when it really kicked into high gears. Also during the Nazi times, it also was already very touristic, but also the population rose in like great margins. And during the wars, also Sylt, my home island, especially Listland, the peninsula in the north where I'm from, became very much fortified, because it was part of it was so close to the Danish border, and was also part of the Westwall of the Nazi and the Atlantic Wall, the Nazi fortification system. So the town where I'm from is basically a military town, a former military town, which basically grew around military, I think a school for military cooks and for basically support jobs in the military. Yeah. So that's also an important point. Yeah. And then in the 20th century, a lot of tourism came in, a lot of the property prices went up, and the local Frisians had basically a choice. They had not much. The people who moved there were a lot richer, but they had the land. And the land prices, because they went up so much, because it was so valuable all of a sudden, they either could still give their houses, their property to their children, as it was tradition through the centuries, or they could sell it, mostly as for tourists, as apartments, as tourist apartments, for basically 3 or 4 times the normal money they could make otherwise. So sometimes it is portrayed like the Frisians basically were innocent in the way that the island changed over the last century, but basically it was just more profitable to sell your land to investors, to everything like that. Yeah, and those investors, they didn't speak Frisian. They also didn't really have weren't really interested in speaking Frisian or the Frisian culture. And I would say nowadays on the island, maybe a tenth of the island's population would identify as really Frisian. Most would identify as German. It's also a fact that the history of the North Frisian minority is a bit complicated. Some of the Frisians nowadays also see themselves basically as a subset of Germans, although their culture may be not really from that, but through the history in Germany and so on, a lot of Frisian culture is also blended with German culture. Yeah, and I think is a little bit sad, and is that the tourism industry, which is the largest provider of jobs, of economic stability in the region, didn't really use the history or the culture or the language, especially to their profit. I think it is possible to use language diversity and these unique features of the region also in tourism and profit and help the language. That really didn't happen. There are some signage and there are also some leaflets or tourism things. If you are on the island, there are like the town signs. If you drive into a town, they are often bilingual, but there's not really more. And you don't really hear the language spoken in everyday life. There are some language communities of older people in certain towns, but especially the town that I'm from, the school teaches it, but I think you basically only hear German and Danish in everyday life, and mostly German. Right. So it's a bit of a difficult situation. And through the mass tourism, through the also prestige that the island basically gained in the German-speaking things, German-speaking sphere, it basically became impossible for normal people to live on the island. There was, I think recently there was in a newspaper article about the dentist who still lived on the island, that he now has to live in a camper on the camping places with his 2 children and his wife, because he, as a dentist, couldn't afford a flat on the island because it's just so expensive. And it's also a bit weird sometimes when I tell people that I'm from this island, because they also already have like a preconceived notion that I must be basically the most upper class that exists. Yeah. And I must say my family was always struggling. Also, when we moved to the island, my parents just got a job there as employees at a bookstore. And I think Sylt is a very interesting microcosm of class divide that actually exists, where you basically have the rich upper class who is sometimes only in the summer there, and the people basically who work for them, basically the second class on the island. And in my experience, mostly that second class is is interested in Frisian culture, that also learns it. And yeah, that's my experience that I had. I was very young when I lived there. So I had, of course, friends at school, and who were also a few friends that were basically also struggling, that lived with 6 people in a 3-room flat somewhere. But I also had friends who were multimillionaires. It's just very, very weird situation. But I think the people like me are dying out. Most people who work on the island don't live there anymore, but basically commute every day through a dam. So Sylt in the, I don't know, I think the 40s or 50s, there was a dam built. So technically Sylt isn't an island anymore, because it was connected to the land with this train dam. But yeah, I would still consider it an island. Yeah, and most people who work on the island who are not as wealthy commute every day. They live on the mainland and basically come there, and it's just a very difficult situation. And yeah, I think that's basically the biggest reason why it is in such a difficult situation nowadays. I think the all historical situation and reasons are basically contributing to it, but I think the main reason is that Sylt has basically garnered itself like an image of exclusivity or being something like for the rich people, for the people who want. It's also sometimes a little bit more of a party destination for some people, like Mallorca or something like that, or Ibiza, which is, it's kind of sad to see from someone who grew up there and who knows it as a small town and a great place to live. It's a bit difficult. But I think Sylt is the place with the most domestic tourists in Germany. I think it actually beat out Berlin at some point. Or Munich.
Is that just flat numbers, or is that taking into account the size of it?
I think that is actually also flat numbers, because in the summer, Sylt, or the island where I'm from, or Söl in Frisian, has around, I think, 15,000 inhabitants. And there are in the summer around 300,000 tourists on the island.
Oh, God.
It's just ridiculous, especially I'm from a town that is 20 kilometers away from the main town of Westerland, of Westerland in German, where most tourists are. And most people just come with a bus to List, where I'm from, just to be in the most northern town and go back. So we basically got lucky with our position, so that not that many tourists are in the town. But it's still ridiculous. In the summer, it just wasn't fun. The great thing is the tourists are mostly there for maybe 2 or 3 months.
Right.
And the rest of the year it's empty.
Right.
And that was also a great thing, because having such a big island, such a also naturally beautiful island to be was a great thing. But the over tourism is just it's kind of ridiculous. And I think you have basically 2 experiences to really realize it, how big of a problem that is. And it is also sometimes that, because the tourists that come there are mostly a little bit more upper class, they are a little bit difficult to interact also as a person from the island. And I think that's the main problem. But I don't want to get too class warfare at this point, but it's a big of a problem. And I think, if I may also bring that point, and there was a big news story in Germany about my home island of Sylt, that I don't know if that's known to any people outside of Germany. We had, basically, due to our COVID relief efforts from our government, we had a ticket that allowed us to basically take every train in the entire country for €9 a month. Really? For a certain time. Yeah. So basically everybody could go anywhere in the country. Yeah. And now a lot of people could afford to go to Sylt. So a lot of punks basically punks, back to the punk scene, Germany basically said, okay, we'll go there. The cheap tickets are dirt cheap. And they basically just occupied the city center of Westerland. Basically to annoy the rich people, which I find funny, which I find extremely, also in the situation, which I don't think it's a bad thing. And I think that the sign they're setting and basically the attention to the problems of the island were good. But I think they focused a little bit on the wrong topic, because it was basically, the punks are annoying all the rich people, and the people from Sylt are all the rich, annoyed people, and so upper class. And I thought, like, I don't think it was also like portrayed like the snobbish people from that island, the snobbish Frisians now get what they deserve because they were so uptight, so against poor people, basically, which as a poor person or someone who lived in not very good circumstances on the island is a bit difficult to hear. And the thing is also, they try to annoy the people and sat in front of the restaurants and drunk and public drinking, very famous free time activity in Germany, basically, but also for the punk scene. And they basically annoyed all the shopkeepers and wanted to annoy the tourists that are sitting in those restaurants. But I think the main point is that they don't really damage those rich people that are eating there. They're just annoying there. The people that are actually affected by it are the personnel that is maybe also struggling or somehow coming by on the island. And who maybe lose their job because it's not affordable with less tourists, with all those things. So I think most of the damage basically being dealt to basically the second class on the island.
Right.
And that's why I have a little bit of a differentiated view on that thing, because it was just a giant story in Germany. Basically, my small home island was in every newspaper, and basically daily you can hear anything that happened on the island. And I was like, yeah, it's good that it's in the public mindset, but for kind of the wrong reasons.
Yeah.
And damaging basically the wrong things. And I never heard a word about Frisian culture or the Frisian language in that setting. So if the island is in the news, it's basically, oh, how exclusive or how snobbish are the people there. And I think that's, yeah.
And then most of these people, rich people from other parts of Germany whose families never were part of the culture originally.
Yeah, of course, my parents aren't Frisian. My family is from Marburg, which is in the center of Germany. But I lived there. Basically, it is my home. It's the place where I lived in my life the longest. And I don't really have memories to all the other places as much as to Sylt. And it's also a reason why I moved back to the north, because I wanted to be close to my home. And in Germany, there's a law that you can basically just, if you're a German citizen, you can basically just say you're Frisian, and then you are. It's basically a free right to association.
Right.
To the Frisian minority, it's also for the Danish minority. So you can basically just, if you're a German living in Schleswig-Holstein, in my state, you can just say, yeah, I'm a Frisian, I'm a Dane, and then you are. Right. And so I say I'm a Frisian. I would say myself, it was the place that basically was the most important for me in my life. So I would define myself. I still have a German passport and all those things. Yeah.
In Cumbria, which is where my dad's side of the family is from, where in the 1800s it was a similar thing. People discovered it was a nice place, and then gradually a lot of parts of it became gentrified, and now it relies a lot on the tourist industry, and people have sold up their farms and stuff like that. And it's not, I wouldn't say that it's as bad as the North Frisian situation, but there are kind of initiatives like, I think certain houses, I can't remember what the word is for this, but certain houses have a thing on them where you're only allowed to buy the house if you were born within like a few miles of where the house is. I don't know if there's anything like that in on Sylt, or if
there isn't. No. There was, I think, for the bordering parts of Denmark, that they are not bought up by Germans or the holiday homes there. But in North Frisia, that doesn't exist. And I think the thing is, the island, the people that can live on the island get richer. So a lot of people that still live there profit from the mass tourism. Right. And so there's not the biggest incentive to do that. And the minority that actually wants to change something is a minority. Those are maybe 5 to 10% on the island. And that's, it's also, it's a quite isolated place. You are, I think by train, the next bigger city is Flensburg, and or maybe then Kiel, and you, with a bus, with a train, you already need 3 hours maybe to get to a bigger town. So it's quite isolated, quite far off. It's not as big as Helgoland or Helligland. Heligoland, I think the English word is for the island.
I don't know. I've never seen it in English, actually.
That is actually the most isolated place in Germany, because it's far off in the North Sea, which basically handled it a bit better, I think. I'm not sure. I've never lived on Helligland. I visited a lot of times, but they have a lot smaller population than Sylt. But they also speak Frisian. They're also, at least most are ethnically Frisians. So that's basically the only island where the ethnic Frisians are still a majority. And their dialect is actually thriving for a small group like that. Right. They, maybe because of their isolation, they could steer the amount of tourism on the island a little bit more. I don't know. But on Sylt, it's basically, if your parents leave you somewhere to live, you are lucky. But a lot of young people also are like, yeah, but besides the tourism industry, I can't do really anything here on the island. So a lot of people just move away.
Right.
For young people, not the, in my age, when I lived there, I moved away when I think I was 9. It was amazing because it was a giant island with a lot of free space and all those things. But I think for teenagers and for young adults, it's just, what do you do there?
Yeah, yeah. We could move on to phonology now if you think.
I'm sorry if I ranted now nonstop.
No, not at all. No, it's fine. No, I just feel like I don't want to say anything that's. I don't want to make some point that's a parallel from England and just end up saying something stupid. Or yeah, I mean, I know there are situations in Cumbria where, for example, like in the 1930s, they displaced 2 villages worth of people so that they could flood a valley to make a reservoir for like water for a neighboring city that wasn't in Cumbria and stuff like that. So I feel like that's maybe that level of displacement has just already happened in the UK everywhere where it's going to happen, and now it's not quite as bad for people that are currently living in places. But yeah, we could. I could do that. Sorry.
I also tried to look up if I find any parallels in Britain. I didn't really find anything. I've thought about the Isle of Man maybe. If there are certain things, or also on Jersey and Guernsey on the Channel Islands maybe, because I think they are kind of in a similar situation maybe.
Yeah, I think the Isle of Man, I don't know much about it, but I know it had Celtic language that was spoken there, which I don't know what the status of that language is anymore. I think it is still spoken, but maybe it may have been revived in the same way that like Cornish was revived.
Yes, I think it actually went officially extinct and then was revived. So I think also in linguistics, you mostly find there are speakers of revived Manx. I think it's also the term that you use mostly of the time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So maybe it's a case of a similar situation, but further back in time, so that now most people aren't too badly affected by it, or the people that were worst affected by it, native Manx speakers, don't exist anymore, so nobody cares anymore.
Probably not. I don't know if I think there are minority languages on the Channel Islands, but I think that those are mostly French influence things.
Yeah, I think they're mostly French influence from what I know. I don't know about Guernsey. I feel like that's so small that it's probably been overwhelmed with tourism. But yeah, my knowledge of Frisian beyond what I've been told by Moritz and people that weren't speakers of Frisian at all, but had vaguely kind of studied a little bit from England. My knowledge basically stops at Old Frisian. But Old Frisian was very closely related to Old English, and indeed I find myself being able to read certain Old Frisian texts reasonably well, even though my knowledge of Old English isn't like I wouldn't call myself proficient as a reader of Old English at all. I have to consult dictionaries and things, but still Old Frisian's not too difficult to read if the topic is kind of something without too much jargon in it. But Old English and Old Frisian shared a lot of sound changes that aren't shared by other Germanic languages. So one of those is the embryonic nasal spirant law, where if you have a vowel and then a nasal consonant like n or m, this is mostly for the benefit of viewers, I imagine you probably know all this, and a vowel and then a nasal consonant like n or m, and then a fricative like f, s, th, I think ch as well. The nasal consonant disappeared and became a nasalization of the vowel, and the vowel often lengthened to compensate. So an example of that would be a West Germanic word tanth becoming tons in very early those Anglo-Frisian, and I think that's associated with a raising and a rounding of the vowel, so tons. And then the nasality disappears, at least in Old English so that it becomes tooth, and then that leads to tooth in modern English with no n sound, whereas in German that word becomes, would it be Zahn or Zahne in German, tooth? And that retains so the n is retained there, but I think presumably German lost the th sound. I don't know if it went through an intermediate stage of being like Zahnd, and then it disappeared, or Zahnt, I don't know, but yeah, and I think this spirant law happened in Old Frisian as well. So words like, I don't know what the word for tooth would be, or like goose. Those are words I can think of that would be subject to it. But another sound change that they have in common is a kind of slightly complicated vowel change called Anglo-Frisian brightening. And this, I think this shows up pretty similarly in Old English and Old Frisian. And it's where first the West Germanic long R vowel gets fronted to something like A. And that happens almost across the board unless it's nasalized or followed by a nasal consonant. And then at some point later, short A did the same thing. So it fronted to A unless it was followed by a nasal consonant. And then even later, I think this happened in both Old English and Old Frisian, this new A vowel got backed again to A if it was followed by a back vowel in the next syllable. So there's like a complicated series of changes that I think probably happened on the continent, and then by the time the dialects that became Old English were imported to England, those changes had kind of solidified. And then the final one that I think some people watching probably already know about is palatalization of Proto-Germanic k and g before front vowels. So this, I think this played out slightly differently in Frisian to how it did in English. So I know in West Frisian, church has, like the word church has a less palatal affricate at the start. So I think it starts with a s, whereas in England, obviously church starts with a ch, which it probably did in Old English as well. So Old English, early Old English k probably became a palatal consonant, k, and then eventually ch, if it was preceded or followed by a front vowel, unless there was a back vowel immediately after it to block the sound change. So that's why words like wiche and stiche have ch, because it's followed by the e, the front vowel e, whereas sticka has k because it's followed by the back vowel a. And those become the modern words witch, stitch, and stick. How does modern North Frisian phonology look in that case? Is the vowel system as big as other Germanic languages, or?
Yeah, so the vowel inventory is as big as other languages. I would say it's comparable to German. I think that's one of the points, besides the word structure, that Frisian basically most adjusted, mostly to Low German, but Low German and High German have very similar phonology, or not phonology, but a sound inventory that is quite similar. So I think there are similarities. Yeah, while you talked about the A fronting, I looked up what the Söl'ring, the North Frisian word for tooth is, and it's ter, which is really interesting, which would be T-E-R written down. Maybe just ignore the R in the back. That's a very specific sound change to Söl'ring, but I think I can just tell you about it. It's in North Frisian, because especially in Söl'ring there was a lot of contact to Danish, and if you maybe know one thing about Danish phonology, it's complicated and it's quite unique. Let's say it like that. And in Danish there exists something like that is called the blød D, which is basically a dental approximant, which is also in this sentence that Danish people like to train speaker of other languages by, which is where this sound is very often in this case. And this sound actually got transferred to Söl'ring North Frisian, and a lot of the dental sounds basically became that. In orthography, that is still represented with an F, so the same letter that exists in modern Icelandic, for example, or maybe existed also, I think, in written down versions of Old English. Yeah. And this sound, because it's kind of unique, at the end of words basically became a vowel. Right. And because it's an approximant, it's kind of nowhere and everywhere in the mouth. As a dental approximant, it's also sometimes velarized, so it's a bit difficult. And in German, or in similar languages as to Standard High German, if you have a vowel followed by an R, German is a non-rhotic language. So basically the R doesn't get dropped. So it isn't not like it just doesn't exist, but the vowel often gets lengthened, or in Germany's case, it becomes a diphthong with a A schwa, is it called in the German linguistics, which is basically a slightly centralized version of A, of the central open vowel. But this sound is still represented with an R in writing, and that's the same in North Frisian. So I have the word ter, which is basically T-E-R, which is pronounced ter. But this R sound, this basically last part of the diphthong, is still what was originally the dental fricative, basically in tooth, which is nowadays this dental fricative is now an R in writing. And it does make sense if I see it here in writing, because in ter there's no N, so the lengthening. The vowel also is maybe, yeah, would make sense. It is slightly lowered, I think. Ter, or no, it's slightly higher.
From R, I think that's higher and fronted, I think. But still, yeah, I'm not sure what the. I'm not sure if the same process of. What am I trying to say? The same process of rounding happened in Frisian. Maybe that's just an English thing. So it could be that the quality was just different and it fronted instead of raising and rounding.
It's for me, it's also really interesting because I speak Danish a lot in my university life, and the Danish word for tooth is tan, or ten. Sorry, Norwegian would be tand, and Danish is ten. Right. And it's also fronted, but the N is still there, and it's basically written T-A-N-D. So the D is silent, which is also a phenomenon that has also a big influence on Söl'ring North Frisian, but it's basically also similar. And if I heard the tanth, the older version of tooth, it basically, I definitely had the association with modern Danish because it's also similar to this.
That's interesting about non-rhoticity. I didn't realize. So it works in the same way where there's like an A schwa, slightly central A at the end of the song.
Yeah, I think there's a special thing if it's followed by a plosive, then it does really weird things in Söl'ring North Frisian. Basically, it becomes a fricative again, but with the A schwa in front. So, for example, the word for church, because you also had the palatalization, the word for church is cerk. Cerk. Yeah, because so you basically have, in this case, a viola fricative in the beginning, which is the originally palatalized version of K, of K. And you have basically E-R-K, and this E-R-K basically make you arch sound, which is basically the R, which would be similar in German. If you pronounce it German, it would be Zerk or something like that. But between the plosive and this this R sound in this place, it became they basically put another fricative in, and that is mostly a uvular fricative, right? Devoiced uvular fricative, with one exception: if it's followed by a P or a B, then it is an F. And that is really weird sometimes if you read it. For example, the word for town is tefp, which is written T-E-R-P, tefp.
That's very strange.
Which is very unique. So I think there are also not really that many different many other similarities in other Germanic languages. I would explain it that maybe because of all these changes, certain words became sounding too similar, and they basically over enunciated then the basically non-rhotic sound that didn't exist really anymore, they began to pronounce it again to distinguish between certain words. That would be my theory, but I could also be wrong.
I think that is often how weird sound changes happen. Either a certain part of the sound inventory becomes too cluttered, or too many words start to resemble each other in a way that becomes confusing. So there's just like a really reactionary sound change that ends up changing things quite a lot to stop them from merging. So I feel like that would make sense.
It's especially interesting because most of those sound changes are to basically becomes more similar to German, or just the High German influence. But this sound change definitely didn't. So something similar definitely doesn't exist in German, and it's also a thing that maybe makes a lot of German speakers say that sounds like Low German, but very weird, with some very weird things. This sound, this dental approximant, which I call it, still exists in modern Söl'ring North Frisian, but only intervocalic. So so the word for again, for example, is weather, and the word for weather is auch weather, is also weather. Sometimes I randomly code switch. I'm sorry about that if I sometimes accidentally thrown. It's not that it's a little bit difficult if I have 4 languages that I'm concentrating on currently.
I'll subtitle just the word auch so that people understand.
Yeah. just also maybe a fun fact. I'm sorry if I go a little bit off topic, but if you just count the number of languages spoken, North Frisia is the linguistically most diverse place in Europe, with 7 languages spoken.
So is that standard German, Low German, Danish, North Frisian? Am I missing something obvious? English? Were you counting English or?
Not really, but also a lot of people speak English and maybe French or Spanish or something through school. But I was also counting Romanes, so the language of the Sinti and Roma, which is a recognized minority language, and Söl'ring, which is either a language or a dialect. It's also a tenuous situation of Danish that is spoken in modern day German areas. The historical duchy of Schleswig, or of Schleswig, was split into North Schleswig and Südschleswig, or North Schleswig, Südschleswig. Basically, it also had a very mixed population between Germans and Danes. So there are now sizable minorities of Germans in Denmark and and Danes in Germany, and that is mostly a language of the Danes living in Germany. But they basically have Sydslesvigdansk, or this specially Sønderjysk, sometimes also called. And they have that and Standard Danish or Rigsdansk as recognized languages. And because there are so many languages spoken there, and because so many people are, if you count each language as a language and not the dialect of anything else, there are people who are maybe pantrilingual or hexalingual in the region. It's a bit difficult because language diversity is not how many languages there are, but how different they are would be my definition. But a lot of people say it's the most linguistically diverse. I would not really argue against it, but I think if you only count the number of languages, of official languages that are spoken there, it's just a place very, with very many minority languages, which also is a reflection of the past of the region. Yeah.
That's interesting. I didn't know that.
Okay. Yeah. Back to the topic.
No, that was a good fact. Vela.
Okay, I have a tip how to easily. This is something I learned in Danish class, because I also I wanted to add there are two different other ways how to pronounce it. There's actually dialectal variation in a very small community on the island. So there are also different ways to pronounce it, but the Danish way would be Vela, and it's basically you try a voiced English th, but on the lower dental row. So not up, but and then basically the tongue in the back a little bit up. So it's a velarized sound.
Vela. Vela.
Vela. Yeah.
So how?
It's
So what's the vowel at the end? Is it just schwa, or is it like?
It's an R schwa, so an Vela.
Vela.
It's written. Okay, I don't think I have the sound on my keyboard, but it's basically pronounced. I substituted it through a through a DH. So this is basically an F because I don't have the F on my keyboard. So, but it's written like that, and the ER at the end is always R. Also, I don't know if it's different in other dialects of German, but in my dialect, only in certain syllables I actually speak this ER combination as a diphthong. In most circumstances, it's just R. So I say Vater or Mutter or anything like that with an R at the end. And another topic that I wanted to get into is intervocalic lenition, which is a very North German and a very to this region very common thing. So also in German, I wouldn't say Vater, I would say Vater, and I wouldn't say Mutter, I would say Mutter. And that's a thing that is also in North Frisian. It's not in writing, so mostly you have a T or something like that then written, but a D spoken basically. So the voiced version of it.
So would you say that underlyingly do you think that's an allophonic thing that happens between vowels and it's not part of the phonology?
Yeah.
Okay.
I would say so because it's just also it's in writing like that. And it's just a very similar thing in Low German, but also in High German dialects in Northern Germany. It also came into slang basically all over Germany through this is a little bit difficult with Hamburg, and it's basically it's different social structures and all those things that a lot of German slang that is used all over the country is from a little more low-class Northern German influences. So it exists all over in Germany, but I think it's a very specific thing that a lot of people that aren't maybe from a certain sociological area that are still speaking it. I'm sorry, I've just sometimes the languages if I devolve into a nonsensical rambling, you have to pull me out of that.
I will. But yeah, I mean, like the same thing happened with fricatives in Old English into vocalic voicing, and that was allophonic as well. So I wonder. I don't actually know when that's supposed to have started in Old English. I think you could probably kind of date it by looking at other sound changes. But by the time it was written down, I think most interpretations are that intervocalic fricatives were voiced, and that there was no phonemic voiced-voiceless distinction between fricatives. So the was always just an allophonic relationship, like the same. And then that didn't become phonemicized until French loanwords got imported that had sounds like that at the beginning of words, so that they had to have a phonemic distinction. Sudden, but yeah,
it would be also interesting if West Frisian maybe also has a similar sound change, because it would be interesting if it's a Frisian thing that maybe just was there the whole time, or is it maybe also Low German influence or something like that. The thing that I also find really interesting is that I think that's a very common feature of American English, intervocalic lenition, and a lot of nowadays American are from Northern Germany, especially in Minnesota, Michigan, that area, because a lot of big ships also departed from Bremerhaven or North German cities. That could be also interesting to look into if there are maybe the North German influence into American English, if there's maybe a connection.
That's true. I was just thinking that before you said it. I think there's I suppose there's almost an exact parallel, like if where a British English person would say wetter as in more wet, American English might say like wetter, which is kind of the same sound changes between like Wetter and
Wetter. Also when I speak High German, I would say Wetter. Which also with the last vowel with the Arschwa basically fronted a little bit, no? Weather. Or Wetter. I would say Wetter. Wetter. Yeah, Wetter.
I think.
Yeah, it's.
Oh, sorry.
No. You go.
I was going to say the intervocalic lenition that happens sometimes in American English does exist in some British Isles dialects. So I think it happens in West Country dialects and Irish English dialects.
I never really heard that there would be lenition in that way in British English, but more like a substitution, like for the alveolar plosive with a glottal stop, like better or something like that. That's the thing that I've heard, but I never really lenition in that way.
No, there's I think lenition to an alveolar tap would be rare in London, although I think some people are doing it now as a result of American influence. Like some people will say better. I wonder about the diphthongs, because I feel like when I listen to West Frisian spoken, I find the diphthongs to be kind of weirdly in the range of what I'd hear from some English dialects, but they don't map onto the same lexical sets as they do in English. So is there much of a, are there many diphthongs in North Frisian?
I think there aren't. I would say there aren't. There are a few that are also kind of unique. It's often a bit difficult with all these sound changes because there are just a lot of sound changes that were broader for that region, which happened basically in Low German, but also in Frisian. Basically happened for all the dialects or all the languages in that region, and also vowel changes were in the center of it. Basically, also in one feature of Northern High German is a slight diphthongization of long vowels. So I try to think about a word. If you have to come up with one, it's basically the E becoming more like an A in certain situations.
Yeah, I can't think of one.
For example, something like I talk, ich rede in High German would be then something more like ich rede.
Right. Okay.
Which is a similar thing, and I think something like that also exists a little bit in Frisian, also in my dialect, but I'm not quite sure if it's a particular change that happened in the language or basically in the broader region, in the Sprachbund of all those languages interacting with each other. So it's a little bit difficult. To the diphthong system, I think there are 4, maybe 5 diphthongs. Excluding the ones that are created in the combination with a vowel and the letter R. Because of this special connection, then you basically have a diphthong, all the other vowels with an R at the end, because the R becomes a different vowel, yeah, and that forms a diphthong. But there's I, for example, in the word for island, which is island. In Frisian, there's an I. One interesting former diphthong is actually that is written IA, and that basically went through a process that is maybe kind of similar to French, where it was a monophthong, and then it became a diphthong, and it went back to being a monophthong, but in writing it stayed the same.
Right.
So that's example in the word man, which means tomorrow or morning. That is written like that. There, for example, it's pronounced man, which is man, where not mjaren or something like that, or mjaren. So that fell basically back. Another diphthong is the one in the word for old, which is all, which is written like that, which also was formerly a a long vowel just, and then split basically into a diphthong. And it kind of remained a diphthong, but with certain, a little bit different qualities. So it's not pronounced wal or something like that, but all. Yeah. And you have, I'm not quite sure how it is in Old English or in, if there are maybe, I think in modern English there isn't a difference, but the superlative and the comparative forms have basically a sound that the first vowel changes. It's basically all, ella, elst. Basically for older, eldest. Oldest. Yeah.
Eldest.
I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
In Old English did have that. Modern English, like you say with eldest, it does kind of have it, but people don't really say eldest anymore. They just say oldest. So it's kind of collapsed. The irregularities collapsed a little bit. But yeah, that's interesting. Yeah. But
also, certain things that aren't really diphthongs, but are just seen as approximant plus vowel is, for example, the Frisian word for fire is this, jöl. And it's a loan word from Danish, il. And which is quite interesting. That's, I think, a good example for basically the monophthong breaking apart into the jöl, into the jö. And another very common phonological feature is that combinations between very sonoric, very sonorized, sonar, very, yeah, sound, basically a nasal or a liquid or something like that. I don't know. Are they called liquids also in English? Yeah. Basically, when there is a alveolar plosive that follows, it just disappears. Mostly with voiced alveolar plosives. For example, another example would be the word for land in Frisian is lön, which also has the same thing, where there was in Danish, for example, that's the same process in Danish, but it's basically written like the German word Land or the English word land, but it's pronounced in Danish len. So the D is also silent. And in North Frisian, it basically also reflects in writing. So those are very, very common features. Also, the word, I said it before, which was the word for island, which is island, also has the same sound changes in this case. Yeah. But I think this breaking up of a vowel, of a monophthong, is a very Söl'ring thing. And it sometimes also confuses a little bit because certain words aren't really that well recognizable to other Germanic languages. Right. For example, the word for one is yen, which also has the same thing, which probably was in or in or something like that. In Danish, it's in every case. And that is a thing. And you also say the end of something. It's also a really good example because the end is dit yen, and it's basically written like the one, but it's the end because the D basically went away, and the rest of the word is similar, so you can't really distinguish if something is the end or the one, which you have to go by context. Yeah,
that's interesting. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Also, one last thing. When concerning orthography, North Frisian, I don't think it's in every North Frisian dialect, but especially in my dialect, it is written similar like German in the way that all substantives, all nouns are written with a capital letter in the front.
That's interesting. Yeah. I don't know how widespread that is across. That's not a thing in Dutch, is it?
No. It's as far as I know. Also, it's also not in any Scandinavian language. I don't know if it's in Low German, but it is definitely in High German.
Yeah. And I think it used to be the case in English as well. I've read texts from the 1700s that have all nouns capitalized initially. But I was going to say, I think the deletion of de in certain positions might be true in West Frisian as well. I think I've heard like horn for dog, but I could be wrong. But yeah, the sound change, the breaking that affect one becoming yen, almost exactly the same thing as happened in the far north of England, where in some places it's yan, in some places it's yen, because the R vowel from Old English got fronted to air, and then eventually that broke into yeah in certain positions. So especially word initially, you have yan, you have yal for ale, you have oh yeah, like you say, I can't think of them now. Yaker for acre. So it's I think the same sound change might have happened in early Old Norse as well. So I think like words like even, which I think was something like ebnas in Proto-Germanic, end up being something like yaven in Old Norse with this ya diphthong.
Ooh, that could be an interesting connection to Norman French. Because in French there were sound changes like that. Maybe it's just a coincidence in any way, any shape or form, but it's kind of similar where those break apart. And I try to think about similar cases in the Scandinavian languages. I'm most familiar with Old Danish, but I'm not sure if there's I don't think there is.
So what about the vocabulary of North Frisian? You mentioned that there wasn't that much change from Old Frisian that was unique.
Yeah, I think it's just the case for every language that just underwent a lot of language contact to different languages that were also bigger than themselves. There are a lot of languages where North Frisian basically took inspiration from. The dialect that I speak, Söl'ring, had strong Danish influence or Jutlandic influence. So a lot of loanwords are from Danish. Special maybe there is that a lot of loanwords also in places where you wouldn't really expect them, mostly prepositions or other structural particles, for example, like the negation particle, which is I think something like I actually don't know how it's in the other dialects, but it's in my dialect it's egg, which is similar to the Danish egge. Or in Danish often the last syllable is also dropped, so it's mostly egg. So it's basically the same, written a bit differently, but that's the same. The word over is our, which is kind of similar, a little bit similar. I'm not quite sure how the similarities are, but it's definitely to over, which is the Danish word for over, which is also kind of funny because it's written exactly like the English one, but also said very, very differently. So you can see basically if there are words that are taken from Danish that they orientated themselves more with the pronunciation than the written form. So yeah, but also some like everyday words like the word for cheese, which is ost in both languages, and the word for beautiful, which is dejlig in Frisian and dejlig in Danish. They're just a lot of words. So I would say Danish has the biggest vocabulary influence besides modern High German or High German that is spoken in the last 200 years. There are words like ungefähr, which means something like roundabout, which is written basically the same with the exception of the last vowel, which is IA written. So there you can see a certain diphthongization, or you basically say, because it's also ungefähr spoken in German, so it's basically an approximation to how in their phonology, in their orthography, it could work. Yeah, but other High German words are actually just the same, so they didn't actually change the orthography in any way. Those are mostly words that are very technical, very for the Frisians who were mostly fishers or whale hunter or something like that, weren't just in the Frisian vernacular at that stage. So more modern words like computer, which is was loaned from German, but German loaned it from English. So, things like that, or Behörden, which is a government office, which is also a very German word. And there are also words like Vierlogger, which is, I think, a word that can be recognized in English, which is, I can maybe write it down.
Oh, I think I found it in the document.
Yeah. Okay.
Steve,
yeah.
Can you give me a clue?
Yeah. Vierlogger is basically an adjective and a verb put together and then nominalized.
Okay.
And the word vier, basically both words have very similar cognates in modern English, I would say.
It wouldn't be like historian, would it?
No. Which other words do you think you got? Which parts of the word?
I was thinking forelooker, like someone who looks before or something like that. But that's why I don't know. I'm not sure.
Yeah, it's actually far looker.
Oh,
so
television.
Far away. Yeah, it's television. Yeah, like the German Fernseher, which is basically the word-by-word translation. So you also have loan words, which are basically only the way the word is structured or the morphology, basically brought over to Frisian, but with Frisian words. So Fernseher, Vierlogger, to far and look. I think that's
the lenition on the k there.
Logger. It's can be a bit confusing if you're not used to that the thing. I think this is just a thing that is maybe ingrained a little bit in me more, that I don't really hear the distinction, or that's not really important a feature for me between voiced and devoiced plosive, because it's just all over the place in the region that I live. So you get used to different pronunciation there. Then there are, of course, a lot of words from Old Frisian that are probably also have cognates, and most of them have cognates into English. Some argue also that this could be English influence, but I would say otherwise. Maybe you can argue with your knowledge of Old English and English history, language history. There are words like to go, which is gung, word like some people or some, which is some, and the word for late, which is late. Those are examples, I think, that have also cognates in English.
I think in order to determine whether it's influence either way, you'd have to sort of look at the whole vowel system and see, like, is it normal for this vowel in Proto-Germanic to become this vowel in North Frisian, and if it's not, then maybe it's a borrowing or something. But I don't see why they need to be.
One interesting fact to verbs that I didn't argue, the inflectual morphology is extremely easy compared to German and to probably older English. It's very simplified. Basically, every verb has only 5 forms it could appear in.
Right.
That's because basically the infinitive form and the first person singular and all dual and plural forms fell into one form. So it's basically also the same that the infinitive. And there's only differences in the past sometimes, but it's rule of thumb is there are only 5 different words you have to learn to every verb, which is very nice. The thing is, often with vowel changes, which can make it a little bit more difficult, but at least compared to German or to other Germanic languages, it's a little bit easier. West Germanic languages. I think that I said in passing, Frisian still have the dual pronouns. Also in use, and as a maybe special feature, we also have a dual in the third person, which is actually quite unusual for Germanic languages. I think that was dropped in a stage.
Yeah, I don't know of any modern Germanic language. I didn't realize that still existed in any of them.
So it exists. It is basically optional. So the plural form would be the, ja. And the dual forms are wat, at, yat. Okay. So they're kind of similar, and it's basically, you can say either wat, which means both of us, or or the Tao, which means us two or we two. You can basically choose which one, but they still exist. On paper, they still exist. I don't know how much they are used nowadays, but they are still a feature. And I think that's also a very unique thing. I'm not quite sure in Old English if there was still a dual form. I know that were in Old Norse for a long time, but
Yeah, Old English had duals. I think they fell out of use during the Old English period, so it might be, it probably depended on the dialect, but I think maybe by the 10th century they weren't very common. I'll put a thing on screen if I've got that wrong.
Also very interesting about the time of all those things, because the North Frisians basically went away from Old Frisia or from East and West Frisia in the 8th century. So if the change maybe also happened in Frisia, but not in North Frisia because it was so isolated from the rest, it would be maybe interesting to see if certain dual forms maybe exist still in West Frisian, but as far as I'm aware, they don't. I think that's and I'm also not sure if dual form exists in any other dialect of North Frisian. Maybe Söl'ring is the most conservative in that way. Yeah, I think that Söl'ring also makes unique is that we still use an alveolar trill for our R sound. If it's not because it's non-rhotic, the R sound isn't pronounced as that, but yeah, that's why I call the language not Söl'ring or something like that, but Söl'ring. So it's with an alveolar trill.
So is that always a trill in situations where it's pronounced, or can it be a tap as well? Because I know some.
No, there is actually a phonemic distinction because the dental approximant, or the sound that is represented by the letter F, can be a dental approximant, as I would say it, but also some people speak it with an alveolar tap, some with a flap, some speak it with an L. That's also very, very similar. That makes it even more obscure, but I think the L pronunciation is actually the most widely used nowadays.
Right.
I learned it with a Danish basically pronunciation, but so that's a sound that nobody's really sure how to pronounce, and different towns use different things. But I think that because of that, in most cases, it's a trill and not a flap or a tap, because it could be confused to the other sound.
That's interesting.
My person. Yeah.
I think maybe there are certain dialects of English, but I don't think there are. The only other language I can think of that contrasts them is Spanish. But there must be a few, I suppose. I think that I heard about one language that contrasts like 5 or 6 different trills or something like that, but I can't.
Yeah, I think because it's such an unclear situation how you actually have to pronounce this the sound, and nobody is really. It's also, you could debate about how phonemic it is. It's basically it's not really an allophone. It's just free variation of that sound. So you can argue either way. I wouldn't say that the tap is actually a phoneme by its own. That would be, I think, overselling it, because to me the standard pronunciation is the dental approximant. But it's a bit difficult. It's a difficult situation for a language with 600 speakers that are mostly elderly, and a lot of people only speak it to a certain extent. Definite things to say about it are a little bit difficult. And there's also not that much scientific research. There is some, but not as much. Söl'ring, the dialect that I speak, mostly exists as a literary language, because there were a lot of things written in this. North Frisian never had a standard language. Basically, there were 10 standard dialects that have their own orthography, a standardized orthography, but never in that way. Okay, yeah, to the last two, yeah, it also has a strong Low German influence concerning the vocabulary. Things like behind mean achter, which is also a word that is used in nautical language in Germany, which means behind, and froge, which is also a word fragen in German, but also frogen, I think, in Low German, and away, weg, things like that. Dutch influence and Romance language also exists. There's also debate if this is English influence or French influence, or where it basically comes from. Something like belt for belt, and flask, pacht, and things like that. Yeah, I think, yeah. To the orthography, there are 2 or 3 features of orthography that I think could be interesting. First, the orthography doesn't really make sense to anyone who reads it, who speaks another Germanic language, because North Frisian, especially Söl'ring, doesn't have double consonants.
At all?
No.
Okay.
Basically, if you have like a word construct, 2 words together, and the one ends with with the same consonant as the other begins, I think in this case it's okay, but you basically have no distinction that way. And the way that Söl'ring especially differentiates between different vowels is by doubling them. It's basically similar to Finnish, and this is my word book, my Urterbok, and here you can say a double U. So it's basically also the only language where you have a double umlaut, so 2 vowels with an umlaut besides. In the example, it would be us, which means us, and something like that. Yeah, I think that's an interesting feature, and also that the schwa is not represented by the letter E, but by the letter I. I don't know where that came from, but
I was thinking that when you said the word for question, how do you say Froge?
Froge. Yeah, and the G is also, if the G is followed by a vowel, it's mostly spoken as a fricative. Okay. Like the CH in German. It also has the same allophonic distinction between front and back vowels. So Froge, but also Weg or something like that. There's a difference.
Out of interest, how would you say Weg in standard German? Because I've heard like Weg with a D voice.
That's a really difficult question for me as a northerner to answer, because I would definitely say Weg. It's interesting. It's basically the same sound, the same pronunciation thing as in Frisian, but not as strict in my dialect of High German. But it still exists. I wouldn't say, for example, the word for king in High German. No. In certain dialects of High German, of Southern High German, they pronounce it something like König or something like that. I would also pronounce it as König. Okay. And that sound change actually now is officially standard German. So there's also the North basically influencing certain things in standard German.
I think if I'm trying to speak German and I'm doing the IG suffix, I normally go with ich, because for some reason I find it easier to pronounce. So I'm glad it sounds like it doesn't make me sound too much like a foreigner to say it like that.
Your pronunciation is pretty adept. I only heard a few words that you said, but I'm quite convinced.
Same with your pronunciation.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I think the phonology and all those things are very unique. I think the other 9 standard dialects of North Frisian don't have the I as a schwa, for example. Right. And Danish doesn't have it, and I've actually no idea where it comes from. I can only think that maybe it was at some point they tend to close up the vowel a little bit more, and it sounds a little bit like an E, but I have no idea.
It is interesting to think about, because when I look at it written down, it does, obviously it looks weird to me because I'm not used to it, but then you think, well, you know, it makes just as much sense to spell it with an I as it does to spell it with an E. Like, it's a central vowel, it doesn't have any peripheral vowel quality, so you could spell it with an A or a U if you wanted to, you know. Although I realize some dialects of various Germanic languages have realizations of it that are fairly peripheral. So like Scouse English, for example, has it much more fronted, like like water.
Scouse is Liverpool, right?
Yeah.
I've heard that they also sometimes make certain plosives in the end of a word to a fricative. I think that's a feature of Scouse.
That's right. Yeah. So I think like k can become ch. It's interesting because k, in my limited experience of it, k becomes ch, even if the vowel in front of it is a front vowel. So what's an example? There was a like a television drama on recently about prison, and there's a word in England for prison which is nick, like just a slang term for prison, which is nick, and this young lad pronounces it like nich.
I won't be going to any nich.
So he doesn't say like nish with the sh, like ish laut. He says it with the ch, which to me it sounds weird after a front vowel, like ich.
It's for me. To me, it just sounds like Dutch, because Dutch also has a similar thing. But if they basically turn the G into a fricative, they I think always have a vela or uvula fricative. Okay. So also a loan word which means against in Frisian, which is tuchen in Frisian, is originally tegen in Dutch, I think. Tegen. My Dutch, I don't speak Dutch, but I think it's similar to that, and so it's basically a Dutch word, but a little bit more similar, also pronounced to German, if you have those two languages as the main languages of the region. Yeah, but orthography, very, very interesting thing. Basically, every small dialect has its own orthography.
I do find that interesting.
That is also standardized. So basically, it's not like it's a guide like Norwegian written language, for example, is. But it's basically that's the way that is a word is written, and not the other way. And I think for so small language community, it's also a very interesting thing.
So they tend to be systematically fairly consistent, the orthographies, even if they're different to other Germanic orthographies. Do they, like, if you know the rules, can you read a word perfectly?
Kind of. I think there's a big difference between insular and mainland dialects of North Frisian. There are the four big insular dialects, which is Söl'ring, Ömrang, Färing, and Hallunda. Basically the dialects of Sylt, Amrum, Föhr, and Heligoland. And I think those are pretty similar. There are sometimes the umlaut symbols and all those things. For example, in my dialect, the umlaut A doesn't really exist. That is not written, the A sound isn't written like an R with two dots over it, but with an E with a line over it. Oh. So there are different conventions for different dialects. Also, the mainland dialects, I think through Danish influence, sometimes have a bolo O. So the Danish A with a circle above it.
Oh, right.
Which the sound still does exist in Söl'ring, but we just wrote two A's and just know that this is pronounced O. So in Froche, for example, that's also, if you know some Danish or something like that, or more historical Danish, that a lot of things in Danish were written with a double A, but pronounced O, like the city of Aarhus. And nowadays, it's basically those two A's are represented by an A with a circle above it. And that does exist in mostly mainland North Frisian, but on the islands it does exist, but the rules basically also apply.
Is there a long-short vowel distinction, or is it mostly quality-based, do you know? Like, for example, in the I can't remember what the Frisian word is, but the vertical you have, is that W, is that like a long U that contrasts with a short U, in other words?
In the word for word, or what do you mean? Yeah. Yeah. I don't think I know a word that has it with a spot on, but it's similar to German. Okay. So it basically, we say it is length distinction, but there are also slight differences in quality. So it's a bit difficult. The only real vowel that is only distinguishable by length in German, in High German, is A. All the others, basically the short forms are slightly centralized. And that's, I think, the same in Söl'ring, okay, as far as I know. Yeah.
I think that's pretty much the same in most dialects of English. Like, any length distinction there was has either been obscured by the great vowel shift, or there's a quality distinction as well, like E, I, or U, There's like an obvious quality difference as well as a length difference. Although length has reappeared in some dialects because of non-rhoticity. So like bid and beard, for me, are distinguished only by length. But we'll see how long that hangs around for before it disappears. I'm not sure.
It's an interesting time for language evolution. I am also curious how the future of North Frisian looks.
Yeah.
Pretty bleak, to be honest, but there are a lot of people who try to revive it, or to basically, because it's not really a dead language, but it's spoken by so few people in so few places, and it is unrealistic to think that this language as an active spoken language can survive the next 50 years. That is probably not the case. Maybe some of the dialects, but my dialect in no shape or form. I think it's an important thing to document all the things, and I will teach my kids that, but everybody has to see if they want to, and yeah, it's basically just hoping, because other languages have better chances of survival than Söl'ring, and we'll see.
Yeah. I can imagine it's very difficult to feel like something's slipping away in that way, especially if it's kind of, rather than being a kind of last native speaker, language disappears situation, it's more of a kind of steady language contact influence kind of.
I think the most difficult thing is that sometimes you get the impression that nobody cares. I think that's the most thing, because it's like, yeah, also a lot of people in North Frisia are like, yeah, but we all speak German, why do we need that?
Yeah.
We all can communicate with each other. We have enough languages here anyway, and it's sometimes a bit like. Also, I was not really a guest, but I was also featured on a podcast where two people from southern Germany were, and they had no idea that Frisian also was spoken in the state that I live in. They also thought that basically only West and East Frisian exists. North Frisia is not really known to anyone outside the region, and which is a shame. Basically, it is only known for my home island, and not in the best way. Yeah, so I think awareness is a big issue, and people who are interested in learning it and thinking about it, and there are certainly different people on the internet also that try to make it possible for people to learn it. I learned a lot of it. I can speak it to a decent amount, I would say. I learned by a YouTube course made by Tanno Hüttenrauch, which is someone who really is engaged in saving the language and doing a lot for it. I think the course is from Frisian to German, so for English speakers, not good. But there are different websites. I think there's also a website where you can learn my dialect as a English speaker. So there are definitely possibilities. Maybe we can add them in the description or something like that, or for people who are interested. Also a very good online dictionary from a lot of Frisian dialects into German, and other possibilities. So there are people who want to do it, but there are just a few. And basically the pressure from all the big languages, it can't really keep up. And minority rights are a thing that is very important for our state government, but not important enough sometimes. Right. It's always like they say, oh, we are so culturally diverse, we have so many languages, we have so many things, but they basically speak about it, but really something never really happens. We have a minority party, a political party, that is actually a representative of the Frisian and the Danish minority. And they actually, in the last couple of years, got a lot more influential and got a lot more percentage. I think they're around 6 or 7% statewide, which is a lot for a minority party. And maybe they can move some change or bring some change in that way. But if I have to make a prediction about Frisian, I think in the best case, it would be something like the Gaelic for many people, maybe in the British Isles, that they know some, and they maybe also like to talk about it, or to use it with certain other people. But as a really alive language community, I don't really see it, right, to be honest. Yeah.
I'm very sorry to hear that, although I did expect that the prediction might be something like that.
Yeah, it's a bit bleak, but I think it's also because there are so many people who want to document it, and I don't think we lose the language itself. I think we lose the community and sometimes a little bit of the culture and of all those things, which is sad. But I think the language itself, because there are so many things documented, there is my wonderful literature booklet that I have here with texts and all those things. There are possibilities if there are people who want to do something. Just the question how much you can do. But yeah, I think there are a lot of people. I don't know how big the community basically is to revive it on the internet. But if someone of our viewers is interested, yeah, we can put some links or something like that in the description.
Definitely. Do you think you'd ever try and create a resource yourself on it? Or do you think that would be too much of a task?
I thought about it. I actually created myself a grammar or a list of grammatical features and all those things for a friend, for two friends that I try to teach the language, because it's not that difficult if you know German and English and Danish. Yeah, I've done some things. I've done some basically teaching some, how are they called? Arbeitsblätter. Some resources for students, basically, to teach them a little bit with certain exercises and those things. And I thought maybe also to maybe create a YouTube channel about Frisian. I thought about it. It depends a little bit how much people are interested in something like that.
Maybe I can the litmus test if anyone in the comment is interested.
Yes. If I get well enough reception in the comments, I think about it. I can't guarantee for everything. I am quite busy with all my university stuff. I am currently working on my bachelor thesis. So yeah, but yeah, I'd like to. I like talking about the language. It's a thing that I'm obviously very passionate about, and I also welcome if people are interested in the language and all the things about it.
Did you say Arbeitsblätter?
Yeah.
Like work leaves.
Yeah. Yeah, basically, but blood also can mean just a page. So it's basically, yeah, it's the same. The same. German also has some more abstract words that are similar. Words are the same but have different meaning. I'm not quite sure how that's called.
I think it makes sense. I mean, like in English, you can say overleaf, meaning like on the other side of the page. But yeah, what's your bachelor's thesis on, by the way?
I'm currently writing on vowel phonemic distribution in Northern Europe.
Right. Is that
so?
Scandinavian languages? If you're in.
Yeah, I am currently thinking about how many languages I want to include and which languages. I thought about more like Northern Europe as a Sprachraum, as a language area. So I wanted to include Finnish because Finnish had a lot of Swedish also influence, and I just wanted to basically get a full picture. But I also thought about if I just do Germanic languages, how far do I have to go in there? Because especially through English, it gets kind of complicated, especially with Creole languages and with certain other things. If I include different Yiddish dialects, if I include Afrikaans, and all those things, so it's a bit difficult. But I'm currently working on exactly what I want to put in there. But yeah, I've actually done a similar. I worked on a similar project concerning palatal sounds, palatal phonemes in Germanic languages, and that was also the inspiration because of Söl'ring North Frisian, because it has a full palatal row of consonants, which is also quite unusual. I think only Yiddish has it in Germanic languages.
Which ones does it have? Does it have? I'm very bad at the palatal plosive, but is it like cha, cha?
Yes, it has cha in tschüss, which is the thing is I often speak it like a alluvial plosive followed by a y sound because it's just easier for me. But actually, it's supposed to be but it has a full row of it, so it has also a nasal in that case. It also has a fricative multiple fricative, it has the approximant, it has also a lateral approximant dental. For example, in the word for light, that is jucht. Jucht. Jucht.
I'm
So
so bad at
in Italian, the same sound exists, the lateral palatal approximant. So in ayo, for example, but it's sometimes a bit, especially initial, difficult to pronounce.
Does Italian have the nasal palatal?
Yeah,
as well?
It has in the word for evening, which is also a cognate, but a very you don't really can abstract it that good. That's in. Yeah, it's a bit difficult to pronounce, especially in the final in the coda of a syllable. But it's in. Yeah, it's evening.
We may have to wrap up in the next 5 minutes or so, if that's okay.
We can do that. I think I have talked about all the most important subjects, and I don't want to. In German, we say "dir Ohr abkauen," so to chew your ear off.
Oh, no. I mean, I've enjoyed the conversation very much.
Yeah, I think that's important things. Yeah. Do you have any more question? Anything that maybe got lost? Maybe one point that you want to ask me or something?
I feel like there was something. Oh, it was about older speakers. I find that in English, I sometimes ask my grandfather about his dialect, which is obviously just kind of becoming absorbed into standard English, like most dialects are. And often he seems to be kind of reluctant to talk about it because he associates it with being uneducated. And as a child, maybe if you're kind of ridiculed for speaking a certain way, maybe even if, you know, nowadays people are interested in it, maybe you have in your head that it makes you sound uneducated. Do you think that might be something that affects older Frisian speakers as well?
I think so. I think that's the similar thing to Low German. That is mostly a rural connotation. Older people mostly not that educated, which is a bit of a shame. And I think the most I heard it was from tourists who basically said, when I speak to someone in Frisian or something like that, why don't they speak a real German? Or that happens when you don't teach your children real German. And it's a bit difficult because, especially for North Frisian, it isn't a German dialect. But that connotation is definitely there. But it changes with the people gaining a little bit more. In the last, I would say, 5 years, there has been a change in how a lot of people see their local dialects. Especially now when regionalism is a little bit more pronounced than a few years ago in Germany. A lot of people basically heighten their regional heritage and more focus, which is also a special thing in Germany because we can't be proud of our country itself because of historical reasons. And it's often for Germans a lot easier just to be proud of their region because we can kind of abstract our region from all the horrible things that happened in the early 20th century. So
plus there's a lot of nice regional differences as well. And I feel like focusing on the region exemplifies culture as something that's distinct from country. You know, multiple cultures exist within one country, and but thank you very much indeed for coming and talking. I appreciate you giving so much time when you've obviously got a lot of studying to be doing. And I'll stop the recording now, but very good luck with your bachelor's thesis.
Thanks. Thank you so much.